Good morning, everyone. I'm Baron Harvey, Dean of the School of Business, and it is indeed my honor to welcome you to this very special event this morning. Howard University is very proud to have two outstanding programs sponsor today's event. The Howard University School of Business Executive Lecture Series, which has provided a forum for leaders in business and organizations to share their experiences and perspectives with the Howard University students, faculty, and the community at large, is a sponsor. And it is also sponsored by the Graduate School's Certificate Program in International Studies, which focus on increasing the number of African Americans embarking upon careers in the Department of State and related international serving organization. The program's focus is on major, tedious, and global environmental issues such as HIV, AIDS, the war on terrorism, democracy, and others as well. We are very pleased to have a very special orator for us today. And to introduce our orator, we have the 17th president of Howard University, Dr. Wayne Frederick.
Thank you, Dean Harvey, for hosting us. Good morning. I'm pleased to have with us today Dr. Yong Kim, President of the World Bank Group. I'd like to welcome you to Howard University. The World Bank currently is navigating some public complaints about a lack of diversity in its hiring and promotion practices. Some would prefer that Howard University not host or engage with the World Bank, but I disagree very strongly with that notion. Howard encourages discourse with leaders throughout the global community, and that is how we learn and develop our ability to solve problems. And that is what Howard has been dedicated to. The DNA of Howard University, Dr. Kim, is social justice. And that includes the World Bank as we support their effort to eliminate economic gaps that have resulted in extreme poverty around our globe. Today's poverty is a global problem. Howard students are empowered by their education to find solutions to these problems. And we do so with a bison spirit that has to have a certain tone and tenor that fosters positive discourse and change. Dr. Kim served as the 17th president of Dartmouth College, which comprises a liberal arts college, professional schools of medicine, engineering, and business, and 19 graduate programs in the arts and sciences. During his tenure at Dartmouth, he is credited with reducing the school's financial deficit without cutting any academic programs. So I think he might be considered Superman. And I certainly have to get some tips on how you did that. As president of the World Bank, Dr. Kim is leading the institution through an aggressive program to increase diversity among its employees. And we certainly applaud these efforts. Those efforts are framed in the context of the bank's Articles of Agreement, which mandate that staff recruitment be conducted, and I quote, on as wide a geographical base as possible. To that point, the World Bank has staff from more than 130 countries. Nationals of developing countries account for 61% of all of their staff and 41% of management positions. Women currently account for 52% of all the staff and 36% of management positions. And sub-Saharan Africa and Caribbean nationals represent 14% of all staff and 11% of management positions. So it gives me great pleasure, as I said in my commencement speech just last week, opportunity is what Howard University is about. And I think today we have a good opportunity this morning to have the president of the World Bank Group provide us with a learning opportunity, an opportunity that would allow him to speak to the things that he has worked on in his past and speak to the things that the World Bank is working on as it goes forward. He is a physician who has been firmly committed to social justice, especially the eradication of health disparities, and his actions speak to his commitment. He co-founded Partners in Health, a nonprofit organization to provide critical healthcare in poverty-stricken communities. And through his work, he successfully challenged the conventional wisdom in the 1980s that drug-resistant tuberculosis and HIV/AIDS could not be treated in developing countries. And he carried this compassion into his work as director of the World Health Organization HIV/AIDS program. So without further ado, I present to you the president of the World Bank Group, Dr. Kim.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dean Harvey. Thanks for that very warm welcome. And President Frederick, thank you also for the very generous introduction. And thank you to the students, staff, and faculty of this great institution for being such great hosts. To the best of our knowledge, I'm the first World Bank Group president to ever address the Howard community. I'm grateful for this opportunity, and let me just say it's been far too long for this day to come. You know, in preparing for this speech, we did some research on Howard's history. I was very impressed with what I found. I'm honored to be at an institution once led by James Nabrett, one of the leading constitutional and civil rights lawyers of his generation, and humbled to be at a place that helped shape the thinking of Pauli Murray, a courageous feminist trailblazer and thinker. Over varied and highly accomplished careers, both Nabrett and Murray worked to make the world a more just place. At the World Bank, we're driven by the same inspiration. Over the last 2 years, I've led an effort at the World Bank Group to reorganize the institution to accomplish our twin goals: to end extreme poverty by 2030 and to boost shared prosperity among the poorest 40% in developing countries. The first goal is ambitious, and it reflects the tremendous progress we've made over the last quarter century in the fight against poverty. In 1990, fully 36% of the world's population, or about 1.9 billion people, earned less than $1.25 a day. By next year, our economists estimate that that rate will have declined to 12%, a 2/3 reduction in the rate of extreme poverty in just 25 years. That means that by next year, 1 billion fewer people will be living in extreme poverty. That's major progress. However, helping the next billion escape poverty will be far more difficult. We've got a lot of work to do, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, where an estimated 450 million people wake up each day in poverty. The second goal, boosting shared prosperity, is what I want to talk with you about today. We're working to ensure that the growth of the global economy will improve the lives of all members of society, not only a fortunate few. To accomplish this, the World Bank Group aims to achieve very specific income-related, but also social goals. We want to raise the income of the lowest 40% of earners in developing countries and improve their access to life's essentials, including food, shelter, healthcare, education, and of course, jobs. Let me put this in perspective. For the first time in history, the World Bank Group has set a goal that aims specifically to reduce global inequality. As the spread of the Ebola virus in West Africa shows, the importance of this objective could not be more clear. The battle against the virus is a fight on many fronts, and human lives and health, of course, are foremost among them. But it's also a fight against inequality. The knowledge and infrastructure to treat the sick and contain the virus exists in high and middle income countries. However, over many years, we failed to make these things accessible to low-income people in Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone. So now, thousands of people in these countries are dying because, simply, in the lottery of birth, they were born in the wrong place. If we do not stop Ebola now, the infection will continue to spread to other countries and even continents. Just yesterday, as many of you know, the Centers for Disease Control confirmed the first case of Ebola in the United States. This pandemic shows the deadly cost of unequal access to basic services and the consequences of our failure to fix the problem. As I'll discuss later in my remarks, the World Bank Group and others have begun to take steps to get resources into the right place. Our actions have arisen directly from our decision to make boosting shared prosperity part of the bank's primary mission. When a visitor enters our Pennsylvania Avenue headquarters, one of the first things she sees is an inscription on the wall that reads, "Our dream is a world free of poverty." While achieving this goal through development is a complex undertaking, two things are essential. First, we have to help low-income countries grow their economies. In the last 4 years alone, high rates of growth in China and India have meant that 232 million people no longer live in poverty. But second, low-income people who live in low-income countries must share in the gains from that growth, and that's not always true. shared prosperity as part of the bank's headline goals simply because it's required to end poverty in achieving our first goal. Boosting shared prosperity is also important in the pursuit of social justice, as President Frederick just stated. Oxfam International, the poverty-fighting organization, recently reported that the world's richest 85 people have as much combined wealth as the poorest 3.6 billion people on the planet. Think about that. A group far smaller than the number of people in this room possesses more wealth than half the world's population. With so many people in sub-Saharan Africa, as well as Asia and Latin America, living in extreme poverty, this state of affairs is a stain on our collective conscience. Protecting an individual's ability to reap financial reward for hard work and success is extremely important. It creates motivation, it drives innovation, and it permits people to help others. At the same time, what does it mean that so much of the world's wealth is concentrated in so few hands? As an economic system, global market capitalism has produced affluence and innovation. These are very good things. However, an economic system's legitimacy is also tied to its ability to make two things accessible to all: the riches it generates and the social benefits that arise from that wealth. Unfortunately, national income gains from growth tend not to be shared among a population in anything close to equal measure. In his 2014 bestseller, Capital in the 21st Century, French economist Thomas Piketty showed that in developed economies, these gains from growth generally flow at substantially higher rates to owners than to workers. Ultimately, we want to ensure the global economic system's gains are distributed in a fashion that creates opportunity and respects human dignity. So what does it look like to boost shared prosperity? As I explained earlier, one important metric is the relative income level of the poorest 40% of a national population. During the 2000s, these earners enjoyed more rapid income growth rates than the general population in 52 out of 78 countries. In other words, the bottom 40% saw higher income growth in 52 out of 78 countries. But our mixed progress in achieving the United Nations Millennium Development Goals shows that the general well-being of households in the bottom 40% remains much lower than in higher income households. In other words, even though their incomes grew faster, low-income households did not reap the same social benefits as the more affluent, including access to food, clean water, and sanitation. Fundamentally, increasing individual incomes, while important, is only part of the equation for boosting shared prosperity. We also need economic growth to deliver benefits that create more just societies. So in addition to changes in income, boosting shared prosperity focuses on improving gender equity and low-income people's access to food, shelter, clean water, sanitation, healthcare, education, and most importantly, to jobs. So how can we at the World Bank Group contribute to this mission? One essential mechanism is our more than $60 billion annual portfolio of financial support to build public institutions and catalyze a vibrant private sector. By creating knowledge-based global practice groups, our reorganization has developed another critical tool, something we've been calling the science of delivery. In order to solve the world's most difficult development problems, we have to ask ourselves two central questions. The first is whether the solution we propose is equal to the challenge. In other words, do we understand the problem, and does our answer solve that problem? The second is whether someone, either in or outside the bank, has found ways to deliver the solution. And if so, if that person or that group or that company exists, can we capture that innovation? Can we apply it, and can we scale it up in other contexts? Our global practices are focused on answering these very critical questions. Boosting shared prosperity is the World Bank Group's way of tackling the challenge of inequality. Identifying ways to deliver the solutions requires then at least two steps. First, we have to improve our understanding of how economic growth at the national level has an impact on the development of individual households. So we need to collect better and more precise data from low-income countries. Second, When we provide project-based financial and technical assistance, we must continue to evaluate these initiatives' impact on low-income people's earnings. Take building roads. In Bangladesh, we helped build and fix 3,000 kilometers of roads. Then we studied whether these improvements to the roads made a difference. We found that in just 6 years' time, the average household income in the areas where these projects were implemented grew 74%. And this was largely because the roads connected communities to markets. But we also looked at areas that had not received these upgrades. Their average household incomes declined by 23%. So these kinds of assessments that we are very well placed at the bank to do show what does work and doesn't work when it comes to boosting shared prosperity. In other words, there is a way of building roads that's more inclusive, and because those ways exist, we're focusing our efforts in those areas. Our experience tells us that 4 strategies are integral to accomplishing the goal of shared prosperity. The first, building human capital. Second, constructing well-designed and implemented social safety nets. Third, offering incentives for the private sector to create good jobs. And then finally, implementing fiscally and environmentally sustainable policies to pursue these ends. Projects that share these attributes are the ones that we will focus our resources, both financial and technical, on going into the future. The science of delivery has also helped guide our response to the Ebola epidemic. The virus is spreading out of control in Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone. Thousands of people are dead. Likely well over 10,000 people have become infected, and both of these numbers are climbing rapidly. As a consequence, our ability to boost shared prosperity in West Africa and potentially the entire African continent may be quickly disappearing. Under the bank's best-case scenario, Ebola will cause the loss of hundreds of millions of dollars in economic growth in the affected countries. This is a critically serious matter. These states are emerging from years of civil war and strife, both of which contributed to their current low levels of per capita income. Growth is essential, therefore, in easing the horrible conditions in which millions of their citizens live. If the pandemic continues to jump to other countries, as it did to the United States, the growth lost could climb into the tens of billions or even hundreds of billions of dollars if we don't get it under control. So unless we stop the infection spread now, there will be little prosperity to share, to say nothing of the number of people who will be unable to partake of whatever remains. The world's response to date has been inadequate. I'm a doctor trained in infectious diseases and have treated poor and marginalized people in Haiti, Peru, Lesotho, and many other poor countries. We treat people suffering from very complicated diseases such as multi-drug-resistant tuberculosis and HIV. So for me, on a very personal level, it's been painful to see us replay old failures from the previous epidemics. At the turn of the century, HIV had infected an estimated 24 million people in Africa. While effective treatments for the virus existed for rich people and low-income people on the continent didn't have access to them, frankly, because of a failure of imagination and chronically low aspirations for poor people, especially in Africa. Some global health experts believed and said very loudly that providing effective HIV treatment to low-income community was too difficult, would cost too much. Today, because of the efforts of many of us, more than 10 million poor people worldwide are being treated for HIV. But I want to remind you, some of the undergraduates probably were probably in grade school when this debate was happening. But there were statements like, how can you treat HIV in Africa when Africans don't even know how to tell time? And these kinds of statements came from leaders of some of the most important organizations. And so that battle, though it must seem incredible to you that people would be saying that who are leaders, that was the discussion we were having from 2000 until 2003. We've made similar mistakes, unfortunately, when it comes to combating Ebola in West Africa. Even though we received repeated warnings from governments of the affected countries, from groups like Médecins Sans Frontières and others. So now we're playing catch up. To determine how we could contribute to a coordinated response, the World Bank Group the World Bank Group identified infectious disease experts who have experience on the ground actually implementing complex health interventions and treatment protocols in poor countries, some of them my former colleagues. We sent them to Guinea and Liberia, and based on what they saw, they've told us that if we make an enormous surge right now, we can treat the sick and contain the virus. The infrastructure we need is not that difficult to build, and we have protocols to limit the infection spread. Most importantly, they've told us that further delay will make an effective response exponentially more difficult, and it gets exponentially more difficult day by day. We're now moving quickly to do our part. We've transferred $105 million in emergency funding, and from the day that it was approved by our board to the time it hit the ground was 9 days, which I understand is a record for the World Bank Group. We put more money on the ground than any other organization, and this ensures that the government has the cash to purchase equipment and essential services. And overall, we've committed $400 million to support treatment and containment. We've devoted a lot of our analytical resources to show that acting now will save billions, but we have to move and move much more quickly. Other parts of the global response are also taking place. In the last few weeks, we've seen significant action from President Obama. The British and French governments are also stepping up. But still, because of the epidemic scope and rapid growth, more progress is needed. If the CDC's, the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, if their worst case scenario comes true and 1.4 million people are infected, the virus's impact will be truly catastrophically global. Concerned citizens need to demand immediate deployments of capital and human resources to affected countries. Otherwise, thousands more will die needlessly. We're fully engaged in this fight, and we're also very committed to this particular outbreak because fundamentally it's about inequality. If we had done what we were supposed to do, if we had built healthcare systems in Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea as we were supposed to do, as we should have done, we would not be facing this crisis today. And so we have to make up for our failure to address inequality. And as President Frederick mentioned, we also aspire to live this value every day in our own workplace. Our employees are citizens of 130 plus countries, speak well over 100 languages, and I'm proud of the institution's openness to differences in no small part because I know what the alternative looks like. I came to this country at the age of 5, and I grew up in a small town in Iowa, so I understand what it means to be an outsider. At the bank, exclusion and bias are not tolerated. Over time, we've made progress in expanding diversity among World Bank Group employees. And just to give you a little brief sense of what that was like, President James Wolfenson, when he came to the World Bank in 1995, not that long ago, 1995, every single one of his vice presidents was a white male. Now we have a very diverse group of vice presidents, and we're very close to having 50% women with representation from all over the world. But we know we can do better. For years, for instance, we've fallen short in recruiting African Americans to our ranks. That's changing. We have asked some of the most thoughtful national leaders on diversity to help us build a broad and sustained outreach to highly qualified African American candidates, and we'll set concrete targets to ensure that senior managers hire a more diverse staff. I expect to see the results coming this year. Howard University is also helping. The university and the World Bank Group are in discussions to create internships for doctoral candidates in economics to work with our development economics group. And the internships would create opportunity for Howard graduates to immerse themselves in development policies and programs affecting countries around the world. But specifically today, I want to invite all Howard graduates to apply for our we're just expanding our analysts, which is for young people, people below the age of 28, which for me is extremely young, the analyst, and young professional programs, which are excellent ways to launch careers. Let me just say, I don't think that a lot of students from Howard see the World Bank as a great career opportunity. But I can tell you it is a great, great career opportunity, and we want you to apply. And we'll be coming back to campus specifically to try to recruit more Howard graduates. And I also want to say that as you prepare your resume, you should know that we already have 29 Howard graduates working for the World Bank Group. And I don't know how many, do we have any here today? Fantastic. Great. We are looking for the best and the brightest, and as evidence here, we have found many of them right here at Howard, but we want to do more. You know, in 1957, the trustees of Howard University awarded Martin Luther King Jr. and Jackie Robinson honorary Doctor of Law degrees. Mr. Robinson had just retired from Major League Baseball and was 38 years old. Dr. King was 28 years old. 6 years later, during the March on Washington, he stood before the Lincoln Memorial and gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. And tragically, 5 years later, he was shot and killed. Dr. King was one of my heroes. As a young boy growing up in Iowa, my mother, who is a philosopher, used to read his speeches to me. I think about him today because of his bond with Howard and his embrace years ago of what have become the World Bank Group's twin goals. 4 days before his death, Dr. King gave one of his final sermons, and standing only a few miles from here at Washington's National Cathedral, he called poverty a monstrous octopus that spreads its nagging, prehensile tentacles into hamlets and villages all over the world. He said that he'd seen it in Latin America, Africa, and Asia, in addition to Mississippi, New Jersey, and New York. He spoke of the challenge to rid our nation and the world of poverty. Dr. King told the audience that in a few weeks, he planned to join others in a new March on Washington. He called it a Poor People's Campaign, to demand that the government address itself to the problem of poverty. He explained that in this mission, wealth was not wrong, but part of the solution. He said that America's capacity as the richest nation in the world gave it the opportunity to help bridge the gulf between the haves and the have-nots. He also explicitly linked justice to economic development. In words that resonate with all of us, he said, and here I quote, "If a man doesn't have a job or an income, he has neither life nor liberty, nor the possibility for the pursuit of happiness. He merely exists." The World Bank Group's two main goals stand in lockstep with the agenda of Dr. King laid out in those days before his death, now 56 years ago. Boosting shared prosperity will be achieved by raising incomes, creating jobs, educating children, and providing all with access to food, water, shelter, and healthcare. By doing so, we will grow our collective wealth and nurture our collective humanity. To paraphrase Dr. King, we will begin the process of bending the arc of history toward justice. Please join this mission. Please join us at the World Bank Group. Your generation can be the generation that ends extreme poverty, and you are the first generation that has the opportunity in human history to do that. You can end extreme poverty and reduce inequality for everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kim. It was a truly outstanding presentation, and it raises some questions for our audience, and I'm sure we'll have those questions coming forward, and we will be giving priority to our students since this is a forum for exchange for our students and faculty. But I had a few questions in general that maybe you could address as we gather the question cards that will be coming forward. One, the World Bank has had a tremendous impact on, as you've outlined, certain programs and activities. What are the priorities right now for the World Bank, particularly in less developed areas of the world? And what are the goals, and how are you planning to achieve those goals? And is it done in a collaborative effort with the World Bank taking the lead, or does the World Bank also play a supportive role in other strategies toward the solution to the world's problems?
Thank you, Dean Harvey. You know, for everything we do, especially with governments, the governments are in the lead. So we follow the priorities of governments. But for example, in Africa, one of the huge priorities, well, now healthcare is a huge priority, but one of the huge priorities is energy. And if you, let's take a country like Liberia. So Liberia, on any given day, has as much electricity for 4.5 million people as the amount of electricity that's used for one Dallas Cowboys game in Texas Stadium, right? 25 megawatts, right? And moreover, they pay probably 6 times what we pay here in Washington for their electricity. So the total amount of electricity in all of sub-Saharan Africa is 80 gigawatts, which is less than Belgium and less than Italy has for all 800 million people in sub-Saharan Africa. So energy is a huge issue, and I've actually referred to the situation as energy apartheid, right? Because it is impossible to grow an economy and create jobs if you don't have access to energy. So energy is a huge priority. And moreover, infrastructure is a huge priority. Roads, energy, telecommunications, all these things. You know, telecommunications is something that's taking off because it's something that we've learned over the past a couple of decades that people really want to be communicating with each other. So they will, you know, I remember when I was in Uganda maybe 15 years ago when cell phones were just becoming available. And what they showed was that cell phone purchases went up and beer purchases went down, right? Now, I tried to see if that would work at Dartmouth, but unfortunately, unfortunately, they all had cell phones already. So, but you know, there's some things that go on their own, like telecommunications, especially cell phones in Africa, but others that require us to come in and help. So it's really hard to say, you know, get a hydroelectric power project or a road built or other things without having, you know, some experienced group, whether it's us or the African Development Bank or others, helping to bring all the pieces together. So we start with country's priorities. In the private sector, you know, Yong, our president, and Keiko Honda, who runs our guarantee group, you know, we know that private sector growth is going to play the lion's share in creating jobs for people. So we're also working with lots of different private sector companies and trying, especially for small and medium enterprises, to try to help them get started. There are huge opportunities in developing countries. You know, private equity companies, sovereign wealth funds, they're all coming to us asking if we can help them understand the nature of risk and reward in some of these poor countries.
Adding to the whole notion of private sector companies, the things that you've outlined that are challenging in developing countries, such as energy and infrastructure, are the same barriers that private equity firms would say, well, I'm not going in there because this is a investment that I'm not sure that I can handle the risk. How does the World Bank, in its partnership with private sector companies or proposed partnerships, how would you aid them as they move forward?
Well, there are a lot of different ways. You know, a lot of times, you know, we will put down our own capital to get something started. The other part of it is that a lot of what these companies perceive as risk is just that, it's perceptions. And they go in and say, oh, but you know, how can you possibly do something like that in this particular country? And a lot of it is just lack of information. There's no way that these, you know, New York-based private equity companies can have the kind of staff that would be able to tell you with exquisite detail about the exact nature of risk, for example, in a particular developing country. It all looks the same. You know, we had the 50-some heads of state from Africa here in Washington for a meeting, and it was astounding the number of times you heard from the African leaders, Africa is a continent, not a country, right? And so it was, you know, a lot of it is just education. You know, we know so much about it. I mean, you know, the thing that makes me so worried about Ebola is that Africa had been doing so well. You know, from 2008 to 2013, it was growing on average across the continent at over 5%. So while others were dealing with negative growth rates, Africa was growing. And it's the vast majority of that was because of the hard work and leadership and especially growth of the private sector in these areas. Also the discovery now of an enormous amount of mineral wealth in Africa. But there were also other things that had been done by the global community that were helpful. So for example, debt relief. Debt relief was very, very controversial for a while, but it's had a really positive impact. HIV treatment. I mean, Larry Summers, former Secretary of the Treasury, did a study that showed that actually treating HIV and increasing the lifespan, in some countries we saw lifespan growing 1 year with every year of HIV treatment. So, these were incredible gains in life expectancy. So the things we did to help Africa actually made a difference. But the fact that they grew over 5% is a tremendous testament. This was during the worst economic times. I think all of us in 2008 would have predicted that Africa was going to just suffer enormously as a result of the financial crisis. But they have been doing so well. And very few managers actually know that. They just see risk. Right. And so we need to be able to be the best we can be at also illustrating the enormous opportunity.
We have a number of questions here from our students and others. I'm going to go with a question from a School of Business student. Surprise. Mr. Aman Lau, are you here? Would you stand?
Do we have microphones? It's okay. Speak loudly. We'll hear you.
Mr. Lau is a sophomore finance major from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and his question is, how does the World Bank seek to find solutions or methods of containment for HIV and Ebola, as opposed to just treating the victims suffering from the disease?
What a great question, because that is the question, right? That's really the question. So the problem so far has, first of all, the problem started because we should have built functioning healthcare systems in these three countries, and we really didn't do what we were supposed to do. We also should have built the capacity to respond to epidemics, which we also didn't do. So, immediately we're starting from behind, and the conversation we now have to have is we've got to build these capacities. But, there are some diseases or some epidemics where actually treating the people who suffer is the critical piece. So right now, because these services don't exist in these three countries, if you were a Liberian and you had a fever and had diarrhea and you started seeing a little blood from your nose and thinking you might have Ebola, the most rational thing for you to do is to get out of Liberia, right? Because services don't exist for you. And even if services exist to quarantine you, if that is not accompanied with treatment, with humane, effective treatment, why would you go? Because essentially what they're saying is, well, we're not going to give you intravenous fluids, we're not going to manage your electrolytes, we're not going to help you in all the ways that medical science has discovered long ago. We're just going to prevent you from infecting anyone else. There's not a lot of motivation for you to stay in those centers. So the great news is that the right, humane, medically correct thing to do, which is treat people with a disorder, is also the way to stem the tide of spread. Right? But it's because we have neglected these countries for so long, we're really starting from scratch. We've got to train the people, we've got to put the facilities in place, and we've got to do it in days and weeks. And it's just really, really complicated right now. So that's why we've just put everything on the table, and I've gone back to my board now twice to ask for more money, and each time the board has said absolutely within hours, because we know how serious this is. So we have to have treatment, we have to have prevention, we have to have high quality so that people know that if you go there, and people are very practical and very rational on this one. They have to know that if you run toward authority, they will keep you alive and also protect your family. But right now, since that's not happening, they're running away. And we need to get on this and get on it quickly. But I am very impressed that a finance person would ask exactly the right clinical question. You have a great future. Please apply for one of our positions at the World Bank Group.
Thank you, Dr. Kim. We have a question from Tulu Kaporyi. Tulu Kaporyi? a master's student in electrical engineering.
There he is. There we go.
Okay.
Yeah.
His question is, how do you plan to help the developing nations realize and receive full value of their resources and output in the global market?
Well, it's a great question. Talur is the name, right? You're talking about mineral wealth. You're talking about all the, yeah. Okay. So, this is one of the great, what's the right word? This is one of the great sort of perplexities of global development. And we call it the natural resource curse. That sometimes countries that have the greatest natural resources have the most problems with development. In other words, it starts very early in the process. One of the things we looked at is just the quality of the contracts between mining companies and governments. Now, the big mining companies are very upfront. They publish everything. The big ones do a great job. But there are a lot of smaller mining companies, and you look at the deals that some of these governments are signing, and they're terrible for the governments. So one of the first things we've done is, led by the French government, we just provide lawyers, just high-quality lawyers to the governments so that they can negotiate better deals. So that's the first thing, just so the governments can actually reap the appropriate benefit from the natural resources. But then the other part of it is that countries like Botswana have done really well at taking their mineral wealth and then translating that into better social programs, better health, better educational programs. And that's one of the things we're trying to do, to try to help countries to say, take that mineral wealth and reinvest it in your people, not just because it's the nice thing to do, because reinvesting in your people is actually investment in growth. In the medium and the long term, it's one of the most important investments to growth. So that's part of the way that we've changed the way we think over the last 20 years, that investing in people is a growth strategy, not just an expenditure in the public budget. So it is the right question. I mean, there's so many countries that no matter how much mineral wealth they have, they're not able to turn it into, for example, growth in other sectors of the economy, so that if their mineral wealth runs out, they're going to still be able to compete in the global economy. It's one of the most important issues, and one that we're trying to help countries with.
Thank you. We have a question from Evan Rogers. Evan? Evan is a senior supply chain management major here in the School of Business. His question is, how can the World Bank be restructured to give smaller developing nations a bigger say in its decision making?
Yeah.
Their perspective is necessary in determining what shared prosperity looks like.
So I could tell, Evan, right? I could tell you weren't a medical student. You're far too well dressed to be a medical student. Evan, it's a really good question. So you know that the World Bank is structured a little bit differently. All of the multilateral financial institutions are structured differently than the United Nations. In the United Nations, what they'll say is it's one country, one vote. It's not really that way, because the Security Council has 5 permanent members and then it rotates. So it's not really one country, one vote, but it is more, in that sense, democratic. We're organized based on initial shares. So because it is a bank, the portion of the votes that a particular country gets is dependent on how much they put in really originally, and then how much they continue to put in. But we've gone pretty far on the path toward reform, in the sense that we added a chair, an African chair, so there are now 3 African chairs. Now the representation on the board is 13. We have 25 board members, 13 from the developing world and 12 from the developed world. If we had to, things very rarely come to a percentage vote. It's usually by consensus. But I can tell you that over the past several decades, we've gone from developing countries having a relatively small portion of the voice, we call it, to now around 48%. So not over 50% yet, but developing countries have 48% of voice. And other institutions are now also trying to reach that level. Now, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right that without the voice of the poorest countries and the voice of the poorest people, we could get this wrong. And it's something that we are constantly working on. We are constantly working on ensuring that in every project that we do, we hear the voice of the poor. And one of our vice presidents, Sanjay Pradhan, writing in front of you, has been a real leader in trying to get ensure that the voices of the people who actually benefit are part of the feedback. So we've committed to ensuring that every single one of our projects over time, for every single one of our projects, we get beneficiary feedback. And what that's going to mean is that I think over time, the best way to keep governments, the best way to keep companies, the best way to keep organizations like the World Bank honest is to put smartphones in people's hands so that they can give literally minute-by-minute feedback on what's going on. I think it's going to happen no matter what. Even if we don't want to do it, I think it's going to happen. And so we're trying to be proactive and not only change the structure of our board, but also change the way we evaluate ourselves and whether we've been effective.
Thank you. We have a question from Duruga Mar Shrestha, freshman mechanical engineering student. It reads, I don't have a question. I just have one request. I am from Nepal. It is one of the poorest countries of the world. There is extreme poverty. Thousands of people are dying due to poverty. I feel like the World Bank has ignored Nepal. Please help Nepal.
Well, we haven't ignored Nepal. We do have a program in Nepal. But I don't have a response other than to say thank you. And I will go back and I'll talk to our Nepal team and I'll say that a very smart young man who someday may work at the World Bank group told me that I should pay more attention to Nepal, and I want to know what the programs are. Right? And there have been a lot, as you know, a lot of complex political conflicts that have been happening in Nepal. And it's always more difficult for us to work in those kinds of situations. But I can assure you that we have people from Nepal working inside the World Bank Group, and we have not forgotten it. And let me make a bigger point on that. It's written into our Constitution that we cannot get involved in politics. Right? So, for example, there's a lot of needs in Syria right now, but we can't go in to Syria. It's impossible for us to do work in Syria. So we're preparing and we're standing by and we're going to try to do more. And in countries where there are political conflicts, it is always more difficult for us. But the most important thing that you should know is that it is absolutely part of our DNA that we cannot leave any country out. Right? I mean, some of the fears in the bank are always that we're going to just focus on China and India and Brazil and the big, so-called BRICS countries, the big ones that really going to have the biggest impact on ending poverty. But we're not. We're focused on island nations. I was just in Sydney, and the smallest country in our Sydney office is Kiribati, which is 74,000 people. Their island is 400 meters wide, right? And climate change is going to potentially wipe that country out, right? So we're just as concerned about Kiribati and its problems as we are about China and India and its problems. And it's difficult to always make every country feel that we're paying enough attention, but we try.
Thank you. We have a question from one of our faculty members, Dr. James Momo, who is the director of the Center for Energy Systems and Control. Dr. Momo? Dr. Momo's question is, how do we ensure sustainable development in sub-Saharan Africa? Is there a program that the World Bank can initiate for Howard and African universities to provide grassroots capital development and support local continent infrastructure strategies for energy and power supply?
Professor Momo, we are involved in so many different projects that are doing just that. So I think the most important thing is for you to come and see us. So our team will give you the card, and then I'm gonna host a meeting for you to come and meet our leading environmental infrastructure specialists, and let's begin that conversation. Because again, we're part of the Washington community, and I think we've had varying success at making it clear that we want to be part of the Washington community. And we've also had varying success in tapping into the brilliant minds in the Washington community. So that's part of the reason why I'm here, is to reach out. We're doing this kind of thing all the time. We're doing everything from looking at off-grid solar, wind based mini-grids and microgrids to provide villages with energy. But at the same time, we need to provide the sort of base load, the constant power that will fuel industrialization. So we're involved in so many different things. We're involved in environmentally focused projects. I mean, sustainable development's a huge issue. And so, when you look at something like hydropower in Africa, is there an environmental impact when you build dams? Yes, absolutely. But we have to now really look at that in relationship to what it would mean if you didn't do the hydropower project and the African countries used coal instead. And so, we're really now weighing the difference between putting all that carbon in the air through coal versus having some environmental impact, but building clean energy sources like hydroelectric power. We're going to do everything we can to provide financing for renewable energy. But that's not going to be enough, and that's not going to provide the constant energy that's needed for industrialization. So it would be great. I mean, I think there would be many opportunities for your students and for faculty at Howard to get involved. And I think you'll be pleased to see how deeply we're into these countries thinking about the questions that you raised.
Thank you. We have a question from Kayla Mann, sophomore marketing major from Aurora, Illinois.
Hi, Kayla. I grew up in Muscatine, Iowa. I know where Aurora, Illinois is.
Her question is, Dr. Kim, you mentioned a variety of steps that the World Bank has taken and plans to take in order to end extreme poverty and boost shared prosperity. So which of these initiatives do you believe to have been the most effective thus far?
So there's actually an analysis of what has happened over the past 25 years. I mean, it's amazing. Some of the data that is most amazing and some of the data that's most troubling. In 1990, I think it was, in 1990, the overall number of people living in extreme poverty in Asia and Africa, is that right, John? Asia and Africa was about the same, over 50%, right? Yeah, 56% in Asia and Africa. Asia, it's dropped to less than 10%. Africa, it's still 46%, right? So in those countries, what led to the dramatic drop in extreme poverty was just raw economic growth. About 65 to 70% of the number of people lifted out of poverty was just due to growth. And so we can say without question that finding ways to help countries grow their economies is critically important. But 35 to 50, 35% or so was related to redistributive policies, including health programs, educational programs, direct social welfare support programs, cash transfers, et cetera. Now, what we're saying now is, yes, we're going to continue to focus intently on finding ways for countries to grow their economies. And it's a very complex process. And so what we're doing is for each country, we're doing something called a systematic country diagnosis. We're going into these countries, as small as Kiribati, as large as China and India, and saying, here are the assets that you have. Here is the nature of the global market around you. And we're going to look at all of your assets. We're going to look at all of the elements of your particular economy and give you the best advice we can of what you can do in both the public and private sector to compete and grow your economy in the context of the market. But also, what I mentioned in my speech is that what we're seeing is that despite the growth in income, they're still lagging way behind in the things that make life livable: health, education, housing, et cetera. So we're going to focus on both those things. On the one hand, helping countries grow, but then also making sure that as they grow, they're doing things that help the poorest. So we may not build every road in these countries, but we're going to build the roads that are going to increase the incomes of the poorest. We may not invest in every company, but we're going to invest in those companies that are both going to contribute to the GDP growth and provide good jobs for poor people. Right? So we're going to do both those things, and we're going to do this in every country. We're not going to do all of it, but we're going to try to laser focus on those kinds of interventions that are going to have the greatest impact for poor people.
Thank you. We have time for 2 more questions. I have one here from Victor. Victor, I'm not going to brutalize your name. Victor is a senior computer information systems major from Lagos, Nigeria. Victor, are you here?
Hi, Victor.
Victor's question is...
Victor taped the whole thing. I'm honored. Yeah.
Victor's question is, you stated that the World Bank has pledged $23 billion to the development of higher public institutions. Is it wise to create a public institution in these low-income, underdeveloped countries in Africa rather than a private institution that cannot be controlled by the government? That way you will continue creating the middle class.
So which 20, Victor, I'm not sure what you're referring to, 23 billion. Well, our total envelope is about, last year was 65 billion, right? And of that, 25 billion was in the private sector, right? And so the private sector, our private sector work has grown exponentially over the last few years. Now, it's a great question. It is the right question. You know, how do you invest? And do you invest in public institutions, private institutions? What's the right mix? Well, in just about every African country I've visited, and I meet with the private sector every time I go to Africa, what they've told me is please help the government do what it's supposed to do. Set the rules, be consistent, follow through, create the environment so that the private sector industries can also grow. Because in Africa as well, you're right, 90+% of jobs are created by the private sector. So what we find is that we have to do both. We have to help governments be more effective. We have to help governments, for example, build the kinds of health and education and social protection programs that we now know are drivers of at least medium and long-term growth. Investment in human beings is a driver of that, and the private sector won't necessarily do that. So it's really the right mix. And one of the things we're doing at the World Bank Group is try to bring our public and private sector work much closer together so that they're sharing insights, you know, things that we're learning from governments and things that we're understanding. If we can coordinate our activities better, we can do things like make public-private partnerships work. You know, Prime Minister Modi, the Prime Minister of India, was just here, and I was just with him yesterday and listened to him speak. One of his major problems is to get that mix right, where the public sector doesn't add burdensome rules and bureaucracy, and at the same time, the public sector is doing what it needs to do to create an environment so the private sector can grow. And that's been a difficult relationship in India over many years, and Prime Minister Modi has said that he wants to change that relationship. So when we work with Prime Minister Modi, what we do is we go to him and say, okay, you have a problem with what we call stranded PPPs, public-private partnerships that for one reason or another, whether it's government side or the private side, just get stuck. And so we gave him a dozen different examples of how different countries and companies have unstuck these public-private partnerships. And it requires both government intervention and efforts by the private sector. I think this is really going to be the development of the future. The development of the future is going to be much, much better coordination and much, much bigger aspirations for these public-private partnerships that can really make a difference. You know, governments knowing what they do best, governments are terrible at picking winners and losers, right? But governments are good at setting the rules, and governments are good at, for example, ensuring health and education are provided to everybody, right? Private sector does things that only they can do, of course, being entrepreneurial and innovative, moving quickly, all those things the private sector can do. And I think future competitiveness is going to be determined by those countries which get that mix right. You can follow up if you'd like.
Very good. We have one last question, but I'm going to combine at least 4 questions that have come to me into one. because they're all in the same area, and in an area than which Dr. Kim has already spoken about to some extent. The faculty of the Department of Economics would like to know, have connected their graduates with internship opportunities at the World Bank, and they want to know if there are opportunities for undergraduates. Is it possible to have your, contact information? No, we don't want to do that. Are there opportunities at the World Bank for pharmacists? And we have another one that's faculty are fruitfully engaged in interdisciplinary projects devoted to poverty alleviation and social and economic development. How do we work with the World Bank and other organizations to further our research in these areas?
Well, this is part of the reason why I specifically came to Howard, because we want to recruit you. We want you to be, we want you to start thinking here at Howard about the World Bank Group as a great place to work. Now, I'm not going to talk about specific salaries, but we pay pretty darn well, I have to tell you. And part of it is because we have a series of immunities that makes all of our salaries tax-free. Right? Now, for American citizens, what that means is that not only do we give you your salary, but we give you what you'd have to pay to the U.S. for tax on top of that. So it's a good salary, but also it's just one of the most exciting, intellectual, but let me put it this way. The World Bank is both a think tank and a do tank. So, not only do we think great thoughts and do great analysis, but then we have to put our money where our mouth is. We have to actually say, okay, so this is a better way of building bridges, and then we have to actually go and build those bridges. We don't actually, hammer the nails ourselves, but we have to structure the project, we have to prepare it, we have to follow it all the way through, and then we have to assess whether it's been successful or not. So, the amazing thing for me is that if ever I have a question about anything that's happening anywhere in the world, a couple of phone calls and I'll find somebody who knows a lot about it. And that's a great place to work. It's a really great place to work. And so our team, we're already in discussions with President Frederick. We're talking about this already, and we're going to find very specific opportunities. Now let me go back on the I don't want to ignore the pharmacist question, right? So we are not in the business of building pharmacies, but for example, I know that you guys have a great supply chain management program. So supply chain management for pharmaceuticals is one of the great challenges in developing countries, right? So we don't do specific things in that area, but we understand that we now have to dramatically broaden the number of disciplines that are represented among our staff. So we are looking for people with very diverse backgrounds, and especially economics is natural. The MBA programs are natural for our IFC, but there is a need for just about everyone because development is just so broad. So we will set up specific recruitments here, and I just want more of you to think about it as an option. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Dr. Kim.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks
Dr. Kim, thank you so very much. I'm going to ask, first of all, let's give Dr. Kim another round of applause. He's done an outstanding job. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to ask everyone, as Dr. Kim and President Frederick exits, I'm going to ask you to stay in your seats, if you could, and give them about 2 or 3 minutes so that they can, in fact, exit. Great. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your presence. This ends this very special lecture, and thank you so very much.